Now we go on to question number 5, in the name of Deputy Joe Higgins, and I ask Deputy Higgins to introduce the question.
Any workers in the public sector, whether semi-state companies like the ESB or in the public service, who do not immediately swallow the austerity agenda of this government and the Troika, are now routinely bullied publicly by government spokespersons and the capitalist press. Now, the semi-states are not encompassed by the Financial Measures in the Public Interest Act 2013, but secondary teachers who are in dispute with the government very clearly are.
Thank you, Deputy.
And therefore I want to ask the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform if he has any plans to use the so-called Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act, and if he will make a statement
Thank you,
on that
Deputy
matter.
Minister.
Firstly, I should say, and I thank the Deputy for his question, that obviously the semi-state sector, the commercial semi-state sector, have taken no pay cuts except at chief executive level in terms of all the legislation that went through, and in fact that has caused some commentary among public servants generally. The Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act of 2013 was enacted, as the Deputy knows, on the 5th of June. The primary purpose of the legislation is to implement the proposed pay reduction for public servants earning annual salaries of $65,000 and more, and the parallel reduction of public service pensions over $32,500. These provisions have come into force. The Act also contains a number of contingency measures to permit pay bill savings to be secured. The person, which may be a line minister or other public service body having power to determine terms and conditions, may exercise that power to reduce non-core rates of pay or to increase hours worked. However, under the legislation, unions and representative associations may conclude collective agreements with their public service employers. Where a union has signed up to such a collective agreement, in this case the Haddington Road Agreement, it will avoid the need for the contingency measures in the FEMPI legislation to be deployed. As the Deputy also knows, the vast majority of public sector workers have entered into a collective agreement with their public sector's employment, and obviously there is no need then for FEMPI to be deployed in that regard. One union, as the Deputy knows, has declined to enter the collective agreement negotiated for the public service. It's a matter for their members to decide if they wish to conclude a collective agreement, and that matter, I understand, is shortly to be put to ballot. The legislative position is that, in the absence of a collective agreement being concluded for members of that association, the Minister for Education and Skills will have to take the necessary measures to meet the targeted payroll savings in this year and following years.
Mouth and Jack to Joe Higgins.
Well, Minister, the reality is that you use the threat of this legislation to bully public sector workers, nurses, teachers and others, local authority workers and others, into grudgingly and accepting the Haddington Road Agreement against their wills. In the first instance, that's quite a scandal, that you cast yourself as a William Martin Murphy type figure 100 years on from the great lockout of 1913 by this type of blackmail threat. Can I ask you, particularly in regard to the secondary school teachers organised in the Association of Secondary Teachers of Ireland, in the event that they reject the proposals and the manifestations of austerity that is attempted to be imposed upon them, what's your role and what's the role of this legislation in regard to that?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
The Deputy resorted to name-calling. I mean, the only time his own party and his philosophy was ever employed in actually running anything was the City of Liverpool. That ended up with running out of money and sacking public sector workers across the city. That's the experience we have of his policies being deployed. I spoke to public sector workers and their representatives a year ago to open the books like all good employers would and say, this is the state of the public finances. And in order not to have dramatic reduction in frontline services, we needed to make further savings on the payroll side. Public sector workers responded to that positively by democratic vote. Now, you see, you can't have it both ways, Deputy. You can't herald them if they vote in a way that you agree with and say that's their democratic decision, that must be respected. But if they don't agree with you, if they vote in a way that you don't agree with, that is to be disrespected because it's a result of harassment or bullying or something else.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Higgins.
For the record, Minister, not a single local authority worker was sacked by Liverpool City Council when it was in the leadership of the left. Not one. Not one. And was a very, very successful and built more houses and more facilities for working class people than your government will do over this 5 years to a far greater extent. But can I ask you in conclusion, Minister, in view of all the strictures and your lectures, etc., with regard to public sector workers generally, particularly hitting low and middle income public sector workers, where is your policy left by the revelation of recent days of the sweet shops in the hospitals being raided for tens of thousands of euro extra for chief executives?
Thank you, Deputy.
And a huge gulf of inequality being created between them and the workers at the coalface? Doesn't that make a mockery of your policy?
Minister?
It doesn't make a mockery of it in as much as the policy must be implemented. I have set out to make the adjustments on the basis of those who are best paid, and if there are means used to circumvent that, it is something I regret. I've set out a cap on public sector pay. That has been implemented across the public sector. We've gone further in relation to the FEMPI legislation and made a further reduction. And workers across the public sector, in public services, particularly in the civil service, anybody who is earning over 65,000 has made a very substantial contribution to making those deductions. And we will ensure that public sector pay, as determined by government, is implemented across all sectors of public sector employment.
We now